So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Is that a knockoff? Margot Sterling sneered, fingering Isla Vance's collar in front of the dinner guests. The silk blend blazer was actually a vintage find, tailored to perfection, but to a woman who measured worth in currencies and price tags, anything without a visible logo was trash. Margot didn't wait for an answer. She let her hand drop, her heavy diamond rings clashing with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed through the foyer of the Sterling estate. The scent of lilies, expensive, cloying, and far too many of them, choked the air, mingling with the sharp tang of the vintage champagne being circulated by staff Margot treated like furniture. Beside her, Chloe Sterling giggled, her smartphone already angled to capture the humiliation for her followers. The ring light attached to her device cast a clinical, unforgiving glow over the scene. "Mom, be nice," Chloe chirped, though her eyes remained fixed on her screen, checking the engagement metrics. Not everyone can afford a personal shopper. Some people have to settle for whatever that is. Isla remained perfectly still. As a senior forensic title auditor, she was trained to spot the tiniest discrepancies, the tremor in a forged signature, the microscopic bleed of the wrong ink, the subtle shift in a person's posture when they were lying. She saw all of it now. Margot's triumph was a facade, brittle and loud. "I apologize if my attire isn't up to your standards, Margot," Isla said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against the rising tide of the other woman's vitriol. "I thought we were here to celebrate Beatrice." Margot's face hardened, the skin around her eyes tightening in a way that no amount of Botox could fully mask. She took a deliberate sip of her champagne, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of local socialites who had gone silent to witness the sport. "We are celebrating the future of this estate. My sister is resting. Her mind isn't what it used to be, poor thing. It's a blessing she had the clarity to sign the transfer papers before she slipped away entirely." A murmur of rehearsed sympathy rippled through the guests. Isla felt a phantom chill. She had seen Beatrice Sterling only 3 months ago. The woman had been sharp, vibrant, and fiercely protective of the family legacy. The idea that she had suddenly become senile enough to sign over the entire Sterling holdings to her estranged, debt-ridden sister was a red flag the size of a billboard. Caleb Sterling stepped into the circle then, his boots thudding heavily against the polished marble. He looked out of place in his tuxedo, the fabric straining against shoulders hardened by years of climbing utility poles as a lineman. He reached for Isla's hand, his grip warm and protective. "That's enough, Mother," Caleb said, his voice low. "Isla is my wife. You invited us." "I invited my son," Margot corrected, her tone dripping with a faux sweetness that made Isla's skin crawl. "The guest was an obligation. Now be a dear and take these empty glasses to the kitchen. The catering staff is falling behind, and since you're so used to manual labor, I'm sure you won't mind helping out." Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He started to speak, but Isla squeezed his hand. She felt the weight of the small, high-resolution camera hidden in her brooch, and the digital recorder tucked into her clutch. She didn't need him to fight this battle, not yet. "It's fine, Caleb," she whispered. Margot laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "See, she knows her place. It's a shame, really. You could have married into a family that actually added something to our portfolio. Instead, you brought home a girl who spends her days looking at dusty old papers." "Those papers tell stories, Margot," Isla said, her gaze locking onto the older woman S. "They tell us exactly who owns what, and more importantly, how they got it." For a fleeting second, the color drained from Margot's face. The glass in her hand trembled, the champagne surface rippling. It was a tell, a classic, unmistakable sign of a cornered subject. Then the mask slammed back into place. "How droll," Margot snapped, turning her back on them to address the room. "Dinner is served in the Great Hall. Let's leave the help to their business." As the crowd drifted away, Chloe lingered for a second, her camera still recording. "That's going to be a great clip," she smirked before sashing after her mother, her designer heels clicking a rhythm of unearned victory. Isla waited until the foyer was empty. She didn't look hurt. She didn't look angry. She looked like a woman who had just found the first loose thread in a very expensive tapestry. She reached into her clutch and felt the cold, hard edges of her professional magnifying loupe. Earlier that evening, while Margot was busy preening, Isla had slipped into the study. She had seen the framed copy of the new deed on the wall, Margot's trophy. Even through the glass, Isla had noticed the notary seal. It was a stamp from a county that had been consolidated 2 years ago. The seal was invalid. The document was a fraud. "Isla," Caleb asked, his voice thick with shame. "I'm sorry, we should just go." "No," Isla said, her eyes fixed on the retreating back of the woman who thought she had won. "We're staying for dinner. I want to see her enjoy every bite." She pulled out her phone and sent a short, encrypted text to a contact listed only as AV. "The seal is a ghost. She didn't just steal the house, she forged a state document. Start the audit on the Sterling-Vance merger. I want everything." The reply came back in seconds. "Understood. How deep do you want to go?" Isla watched Margot take her seat at the head of the table, presiding over a kingdom built on lies. She felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. "I want the ground to disappear under her feet," Isla typed. "Don't leave her a single brick." That evening, the dining room of the Sterling estate was a masterclass in performative elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a cold, sharp light over the table, making the heavy sterling silver gleam like surgical instruments. The scent of rosemary and roasted lamb filled the air, but to Isla Vance, it smelled like a funeral. Margot Sterling sat at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as the high-backed velvet chair she claimed as her throne. She hadn't even waited for the staff to finish serving before she began her victory lap. She reached out, her manicured fingers, adorned with a diamond the size of a grape, flicking a stray crumb off the lace tablecloth. "It really is for the best, Mother," Margot said, her voice dripping with a false, honeyed concern as she looked toward the far end of the table. Beatrice Sterling sat there, her eyes bright and sharp, though she remained silent. She was the woman Margot had spent the last 6 months painting as confused and unfit. Margot had even moved the matriarch's chair further away from the center of the conversation, effectively relegating the true owner of the house to a spectator in her own home. "The guest cottage is far too drafty for Caleb and his guest," Margot continued, casting a dismissive glance at Isla. "And this main house requires a certain level of maintenance that a lineman's salary simply cannot provide. I've already contacted the movers for Monday morning." Caleb Sterling gripped his fork so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked at his mother, his voice low and strained. "The cottage isn't drafty, Margot. I've spent every weekend for 3 years fixing the insulation and the roof. It's our home." "It was a courtesy, Caleb," Chloe Sterling interrupted, not looking up from her phone. She was currently angling her device to capture the perfect shot of her wine glass against the backdrop of the expensive artwork. "But let's be real. My followers are already obsessed with the estate rebirth series I'm filming. A lineman and what do you do again, Isla? Paperwork. It just doesn't fit the brand." Isla felt the vibration of her phone in her lap. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. She knew the rhythm of the alerts from Arthur Vance. One long pulse meant the deep dive audit was live. 2 short pulses meant the first red flag had been verified by the state database. Her phone buzzed twice. "I do forensic title auditing, Chloe," Isla said, her voice calm and level. She picked up her water glass, the condensation chilling her palm. "It's about looking at what's hidden beneath the surface. You'd be surprised how often a beautiful facade is held up by nothing but air." Margot let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "How poetic. But in the real world, Isla, we deal in signatures and seals. And as you saw today, the Sterling-Vance merger is finalized. This house, the grounds, and the family trust are under my sole direction." "Are you sure about that?" Isla asked. She took a slow sip of water, watching Margot over the rim of the glass. "I noticed the notary seal on the transfer deed today. It was quite distinctive." Margot's smirk didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "It's a standard legal mark. Perhaps you're used to looking at smaller, less significant properties." "On the contrary," Isla replied, setting the glass down with a precise, muted click against the wood. I'm used to looking at ghosts. For instance, the seal on your document belonged to a county office that was consolidated into the state archives 2 years ago. That particular stamp hasn't been legal for 24 months. The table went silent. Even Chloe paused her recording, her phone hovering midair. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Margot's face didn't collapse yet, but the color began to shift, a subtle, sickly paleness creeping up her neck. She forced a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. A clerical error, I'm sure. My lawyers are the best in the city. They don't make mistakes. Lawyers don't, Isla said, leaning forward just an inch into the light. But people who are in a hurry to steal an inheritance often do. They grab whatever old stamp is in the back of a drawer, thinking no one will ever look close enough to see the expiration date. Isla's phone buzzed again, 3 times. The mic drop signal from her father. "What are you talking about?" Caleb asked, looking between his wife and his sister. Isla stood up, smoothing the front of her modest dress. She looked at Margot, who was now gripping the edge of the table so tightly the wood creaked. "I'm talking about the fact that tomorrow morning at 10, a state investigator will be arriving at the Sterling Vance corporate headquarters," Isla said, her voice echoing in the sudden vacuum of the room. "And Margot, I'd suggest you spend the night packing. Not for Caleb and me, but for yourself. Because when a document is forged to seize an estate, the state doesn't just invalidate the deed. They call it a felony." Isla turned to Beatrice and offered a small, respectful nod. Then she looked back at the woman at the head of the table. "Enjoy the lamb, Margot," Isla whispered. "It's the last meal you'll ever eat in this house." She turned and walked toward the foyer, leaving the sound of Margot's frantic, ragged breathing behind her. She had 24 hours until the hammer dropped, and she wanted to be sure she didn't miss a single second of the impact. The following morning, the air inside the Sterling estate was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and cold desperation. Isla Vance sat in the quiet sanctuary of the library, her fingers tracing the embossed spine of a heavy, leather-bound volume that Margot Sterling had spent a decade trying to bury. It was the original ledger of the Sterling Vance Foundation, a relic of a time when the family name stood for something more than inherited arrogance. Arthur Vance entered the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that made Isla's pulse quicken. Her father didn't look like a retired judge today. He looked like an executioner in a tailored charcoal suit. He laid a single, manila envelope on the desk between them. Inside was the certified forensic report Isla had spent the last 6 hours finalizing. The black ledger of Margot's secret accounts, cross-referenced with the forged signatures on Beatrice's estate transfer. "It's all here, Isla," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "The paper trail doesn't just lead to Margot, it starts with her. She didn't just steal the estate. She's been systematically draining Beatrice's trust for 5 years to fund Chloe's influencer lifestyle and her own charity galas." Isla felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. "And the state investigator. 10 o'clock sharp," her father confirmed, checking his silver pocket watch. "They're bringing a warrant for the digital servers." Margot thinks she's deleted the evidence, but she doesn't realize that forensic auditors don't need the files you keep. "We find the ones you thought were gone." Isla stood, the weight of the ledger in her hand feeling like a weapon. She left the library and headed toward the grand staircase, the sound of her modest flats muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She found Margot in the morning room, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The older woman was dressed in a crisp, ivory Chanel suit that probably cost more than Caleb's truck, but the elegance was betrayed by the way her hand trembled as she held a crystal glass of water. "You're still here," Margot said, not turning around. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual honeyed venom. "I assumed you'd be halfway to the airport by now, clutching whatever little dignity you have left." "I'm not the one who should be worried about dignity, Margot," Isla replied, her voice level and ice-cold. Margot turned then, her eyes narrowed and rimmed with red. She looked at Isla with a sneer that didn't quite reach her trembling lips. "Do you honestly think anyone will believe a word you say? You're a forensic auditor for the state, Isla, a glorified bean counter. I'm a Sterling. My name is on the hospital wings, the museum boards, and the deeds to half the property in this county." She took a step closer, the scent of her aggressive, floral perfume filling the space. You think you're protecting Caleb. You're ruining him. If you go through with this little stunt, I will ensure he never works as a lineman again. I'll have him blacklisted from every utility company in the tri-state area. He'll be a high-voltage worker who can't get a job changing a light bulb. The rage spike hit Isla like a physical blow. The sheer entitlement of a woman who would destroy her own son's livelihood to protect a lie was staggering. Isla didn't flinch. She watched a bead of sweat break through Margot's heavy foundation, tracing a path down her jawline. "Is that your move, Margot? Threatening Caleb's career?" Isla took a step forward, invading the older woman's personal space. "You've spent so long looking down at people like us that you've forgotten how the ground works. You think your name is a shield. In 2 hours, that name is going to be a lead weight." Margot's face flushed a mottled purple. "I'll give you $5 million, right now. A consultation fee for your services. You take the money, you tell your investigator there was a clerical error, and you and Caleb move to some quiet little town where you can play house and never bother me again." Isla felt the cold condensation on the water glass Margot had set down. It was the same coldness she felt in her own heart. $5 million. That's barely half of what you siphoned out of Beatrice's medical trust last year alone. Margot froze. The color drained from her face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do, and so does Arthur," Isla said. She leaned in closer, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of a gavel. "I didn't just find the forged deed, Margot. I found the black ledger. Every shell company, every offshore transfer, every cent you stole from a woman who thought you were her family." Isla turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. She looked back at the woman who had tried to buy her silence with stolen money. "You have exactly 90 minutes until the state investigator walks through that front door. I'd suggest you spend them looking at this house. Take a good, long look at the marble, the art, and the history." Margot's hand went to her throat, her knuckles white against her pearls. "You can't do this. I'm the matriarch of this family." "No," Isla said, her hand resting on the heavy brass door handle. "You're a tenant with an expired lease, and the landlord is finally home." Isla walked away, the sound of Margot's frantic, ragged breathing echoing in the hallway. She went to find Caleb. He was in the garage, his hands stained with oil as he worked on the engine of his old truck, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over the roof of the Sterling estate. She watched him for a moment, the man who had been told he was nothing by a woman who had stolen everything. She touched the manila envelope in her bag. The countdown had reached the final hour. In 60 minutes, the world Margot Sterling had built on a foundation of lies was going to come crashing down, and Isla Vance was going to make sure she was standing right there to watch the first stone fall. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 5, its deep, resonant chime echoing through the marble hallways of the Sterling estate. Isla Vance had left Caleb in the garage and moved back into the heart of the house, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs. She found Margot in the drawing room, the air thick with the cloying scent of lilies and expensive gin. Margot Sterling was perched on the edge of a velvet wingback chair, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet that glittered on her wrist with obsessive precision. Beside her, Chloe was lounging on the sofa, her eyes glued to her phone and her lip curled in a permanent expression of bored entitlement. The room was a shrine to stolen wealth, gold-leafed mirrors, original oil paintings, and crystal carafes that caught the afternoon sun. "Still here?" Margot asked, her voice sharp as a razor. She didn't bother looking up. "I thought I made it clear that your presence is no longer required, or perhaps you're waiting for a tip. I don't give handouts to people who track dust onto my floors." Isla walked to the fireplace, her fingers brushing the cold, polished marble of the mantel. "I'm just admiring the architecture," she replied, her voice steady and deceptively calm. "It's a beautiful house. It would be a shame if something as simple as a filing error brought the whole thing down." Margot let out a dry, hacking laugh. She finally looked at Isla, her eyes filled with a mixture of cold amusement and genuine confusion. "A filing error? Is that what you little clerks do? threaten people with paperwork when you realize you have no real power. This house has been in the Sterling family for generations. My name is on the deed, and my word is law here. You're a mouse trying to roar at a lion." Chloe didn't look up from her screen, her thumbs flying across the glass. "Mom, stop talking to the help. Her shoes are literally scuffing the finish. It's embarrassing to even have her in the same room as the foundation guests." Isla felt the weight of the manila envelope tucked into her bag. Inside lay the certified report from the state archives, the one that proved the generations of ownership, ended with a forged signature 3 years ago. The paper felt like a live wire against her hip. The heavy oak doors creaked open as Caleb entered, still wiping grease from his calloused hands with a stained rag. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepening as he felt the heavy tension in the room. He stopped near the door, clearly hesitant to step further onto the pristine rug. "Get out, Caleb," Margot snapped, her face contorting with sudden, visceral disgust. "You're tracking filth into the house. Honestly, I don't know why I let you stay in the garage. You belong in a trailer park, not a Sterling drawing room. Go wash that stench off before the guests arrive." Isla watched the way Caleb flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. She felt a surge of cold fury, but she kept her face a mask of professional indifference. The arrogance was reaching its peak, a fevered dream of entitlement that blinded them to the cliff they were walking toward. "You should be careful how you treat the people who actually keep this place standing," Isla said softly. "The foundation of a house isn't just stone and mortar, Margot. It's integrity. And yours is looking remarkably thin this evening." Margot stood up, her silk dress rustling with a sound like a snake in dry grass. She walked over to Isla, stopping just inches away. The smell of gin was stronger now, sharp and medicinal. "Listen to me, you insignificant little auditor. In 45 minutes, the board of the Sterling Foundation will be here for the annual gala. I will be confirmed as the sole executor of the entire estate. And you will be a forgotten footnote. Now get out before I have security drag you to the gate and toss you into the street where you belong." Isla checked her phone. A single message from Arthur Vance sat on the screen. "The sheriff is 10 minutes out. The board has been briefed on the special presentation." "I wouldn't miss that gala for the world," Isla said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. She turned and walked toward the foyer, her heels clicking with rhythmic finality against the marble. She left Margot staring at her back with a look of irritated confusion. The countdown had reached the final stretch, and the storm was no longer on the horizon. It was already inside the house. The evening arrived with a stifling, artificial elegance that hung over the Sterling estate like a shroud. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and the rhythmic clinking of crystal flutes. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of overbloomed lilies and the sharp, expensive sting of Margot Sterling's perfume. She stood at the center of the marble floor, draped in an emerald silk gown that probably cost more than a lineman's annual salary. A necklace of heavy, teardrop diamonds, Beatrice's diamonds, caught the light of the chandeliers, casting fractured glints across the room as she threw her head back in a practiced, melodic laugh. Isla Vance stepped through the heavy oak doors, her presence a quiet, sharpened blade in a room full of dull ornaments. She hadn't donned a gown. Instead, she wore a charcoal gray tailored suit, its lines so precise they felt like a warning. Her heels clicked against the polished stone with a steady, military cadence that cut through the low hum of polite conversation. In her right hand, she carried a slim, leather-bound tablet, its screen dark but its potential explosive. She scanned the room, noting the positions of the key players. The board members of the Sterling Foundation were clustered near the dais, their faces grave and expectant. Among them stood Arthur Vance, his silver hair catching the light as he leaned in to speak with the Foundation's lead counsel. He didn't acknowledge his daughter with anything more than a brief, imperceptible nod, but the weight of his presence provided an invisible anchor to the room. "Oh, look what the cat dragged in," a sharp voice sliced through the air. Margot was suddenly there, blocking Isla's path. She held a glass of vintage champagne, her eyes raking over Isla's suit with visceral disgust. "I thought I made it clear that the help was to use the service entrance, Isla. This is a gala for the board, not a workspace for a glorified bookkeeper." Isla didn't flinch. She met the older woman's gaze with a terrifyingly calm smile. "I'm not here to balance the books tonight, Margot. I'm here to ensure the Foundation's transition is handled with absolute transparency." Margot's lip curled. She leaned closer, the smell of gin and expensive botanicals wafting from her. "Transparency? You're a footnote, a buzzing fly I'm about to swat. Do you see these people?" She gestured vaguely to the room of millionaires and power brokers. "They don't see you." "They see me. They see the Sterling name. When I step onto that stage in 10 minutes, I become the law in this house. You'll be lucky if I don't have you blacklisted from every firm in the state." She turned her back on Isla before a response could be given, spotting Caleb near the buffet. He looked uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, his large, calloused hands fidgeting with his tie. Margot marched over to him, her voice rising just enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Caleb, darling, do try to stand up straight," she snapped, her tone dripping with condescension. "You look like a bear in a circus suit, and please stop talking to the guests about the wiring. No one cares how the lights stay on. They only care that they're shining on me. Go find Chloe and tell her to stop checking her engagement metrics for 5 minutes. It's time for the presentation." Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but he simply nodded and turned away. The sight of his quiet humiliation sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Isla's veins. She felt the weight of the tablet in her hand, the digital files inside containing the scanned original deed, and the forensic breakdown of the forged signatures Margot had used to disenfranchise her own mother. Isla moved toward the back of the room, positioning herself near the AV booth. She watched Chloe Sterling weaving through the crowd, her phone held aloft as she live-streamed the event to her followers. "Hey guys," Chloe chirped into the camera, her voice high and grating. "We are literally minutes away from my mom being named the head of the whole Sterling empire. It's a total vibe. Stay tuned for the big reveal." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Isla glanced at her watch. 5 minutes. She tapped the screen of her tablet, bringing up the remote override for the ballroom's projection system. A small green icon flickered to life, indicating a successful handshake with the server. A hush began to fall over the room as the chairman of the board stepped up to the microphone. Margot smoothed her dress, her expression shifting from venomous to saintly in a heartbeat. She began to walk toward the dais, her head held high, the diamonds at her throat sparkling with stolen light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman began, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "Tonight, we honor the legacy of the Sterling family and ensure its future. Following the unfortunate decline of our matriarch, Beatrice, we are here to officially confirm the new executor of the estate." Margot reached the top of the stairs, turning to face the crowd with a triumphant, predatory glow. She looked out over the sea of faces, her eyes finally landing on Isla at the back of the room. She offered a tiny, mocking wave of her hand, her fingers fluttering in a silent goodbye. Isla didn't wave back. She reached out and touched the execute command on her screen. The massive projector screen behind Margot hummed as it began to descend, a blank white canvas waiting for the truth. "Before we proceed with the signing," Isla's voice rang out, projected through the room's hidden speakers as she overrode the chairman's microphone. "I believe there is one piece of evidence the board has yet to see." The room went deathly silent. Every head turned toward the back of the hall. Margot's smile froze, her hand hovering over the ceremonial pen. The screen behind her flickered, and the first image appeared. A high-resolution scan of the original 1958 deed, with Beatrice Sterling's bold, unmistakable signature highlighted in blue. Beside it, the forged document Margot had filed 3 months ago appeared in a jarring, blood-red frame. The storm had officially made landfall. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the cavernous Sterling ballroom, a low, mechanical drone that filled the vacuum left by the room's collective breath. Isla stood at the edge of the stage, her silhouette sharp against the glowing evidence. Margot's hand, still clutching the gold-plated fountain pen, began to tremor. A single drop of black ink fell, blooming like a dark, indelible bruise on the white linen tablecloth. On the massive screen, the side-by-side comparison was a death warrant for Margot's reputation. The authentic 1958 deed showed Beatrice Sterling's signature, fluid, confident, and looping with the grace of a woman who knew her worth. Beside it, the forgery Margot had filed 3 months ago was revealed as a jagged, desperate imitation. Red boxes highlighted the forensic inconsistencies: a missing serif on the S, a slight hesitation in the ink flow of the T, and a date stamp that used a font not manufactured until 1974. Margot Sterling's face didn't just change, it disintegrated. The carefully applied porcelain foundation seemed to crack as the blood drained from her skin, leaving her a sickly, translucent gray. Her eyes, usually narrowed with calculated malice, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the pupils, reflecting the blue light of the projector like a trapped animal. Her mouth hung open in a jagged, silent O, her lower lip twitching rhythmically while her throat worked in frantic, visible gulps. The regal posture she'd spent decades perfecting collapsed, her shoulders hunching forward as if the very air in the room had suddenly gained the weight of lead. She looked smaller, older, and suddenly, pathetically transparent. "This is an absolute outrage," Chloe shrieked from the front row. Her phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor and ending the live stream she'd been using to flaunt her family's supposed triumph. Her face was a mask of indignant confusion, the influencer persona stripped away to reveal a panicked child. Beside her, Caleb Sterling stood slowly. He didn't look at his daughter, and he certainly didn't look at his wife. He stared at the screen, his weathered face tightening with a realization that looked like grief before it hardened into a cold, granite anger. Arthur Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the back row. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, honed by 30 years on the bench, carried the weight of absolute law. "As a retired judge of the appellate court," he said, his eyes fixed on Margot with a hunter's precision, "I can confirm the forensic markers on that document are consistent with high-level felony forgery. This isn't just a board matter anymore. This is a criminal one." Margot finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy ghost of its former self. You little rat," she hissed, lunging toward the podium, her expensive silk sleeves fluttering like the wings of a grounded bird. "You planted this. You're a title auditor. You tampered with the digital files to humiliate me." Isla didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. "I didn't have to tamper with anything, Margot. You were so blinded by your own arrogance that you forgot one simple rule of the Sterling estate." Isla stepped closer, the cloying, floral scent of Margot's lily perfume clashing with the metallic ozone of the projector. "Beatrice Sterling didn't just sign that deed in 1958. She filmed the signing. The original 16 reel has been sitting in a safety deposit box at the very bank I happen to audit. I've seen the film. I've seen the truth. And now, so has everyone else." The room erupted. The board members, men and women who had been Margot's closest allies only minutes ago, stood up in a synchronized wave of abandonment. They physically distanced themselves, moving toward the exits or the far corners of the hall as if Margot's looming legal collapse were contagious. "You told me I didn't belong in this house," Isla said, her voice a razor-thin blade of ice that cut through the rising murmurs. "You said I was a modest little clerk who should know her place." She leaned in, her eyes locking onto Margot's crumbling gaze. "My place is behind the desk that signs your eviction notice. You have until midnight to pack your designer bags. The police are waiting in the foyer to discuss the felony fraud charges." Isla didn't wait for the scream she knew was coming. She turned on her heel, her modest heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. She walked past the stunned guests, past the frozen Caleb, and straight out the double mahogany doors. Behind her, the sound of Margot's first hysterical shriek echoed through the hall, a shrill, broken sound that signaled the end of an era. Isla didn't look back. The storm hadn't just made landfall. It had leveled the foundation, and she was already walking toward the light of a new day. The silence in the grand foyer didn't last long, shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of polished boots against the marble. Isla Vance had reached the threshold of the double doors when the first pair of uniformed officers stepped past her, their presence a cold, blue contrast to the warm amber glow of the Sterling estate. She didn't keep walking. She paused, turning just enough to witness the final structural collapse of the woman who had tried to bury her. Margot Sterling didn't just pale. Her face seemed to physically erode in real time. The carefully applied layers of expensive foundation cracked as her jaw worked soundlessly, her skin turning a sickly, mottled gray that clashed violently with the designer pearls at her throat. Her eyes, usually sharp with the predatory judgment of a woman who bought and sold reputations, went wide and glassy, darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for a hole that didn't exist. The veins in her neck corded, thick and pulsing against her skin, as the reality of the word, felony, finally pierced through her armor of entitlement. She looked less like a socialite and more like a crumbling statue of salt, her posture sagging until she was forced to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to remain upright, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. "There must be some mistake," Margot gasped, her voice a thin, reedy shadow of its former command. She looked toward the guests, searching for a friendly face, but the social circle she had cultivated with such cruelty was already widening. Caleb Sterling stood 5 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't even look angry anymore. He looked exhausted, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he were finally seeing the rot in the foundation of his own home. Beside him, Chloe Sterling had dropped her phone, the screen cracked against the floor, her face a mask of panicked realization that her mother's influence was about to become a lead weight around both their necks. "No mistake, Margot," a new voice boomed, cutting through the frantic whispers of the guests. Arthur Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, his stride carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent 30 years on a judicial bench. He held a thick, leather-bound folder, the gold seal of the state auditor's office catching the light. He didn't look at the police. He looked directly at the woman who had spent the last month calling his daughter a modest little clerk. "The forensic audit is complete," Arthur said, his voice calm and terrifyingly final. "We found the original deed tucked into a dormant offshore account ledger you thought was untraceable. You didn't just forge the signature. You attempted to digitize a lie that had a paper trail 10 miles long." The guests, once Margot's loyal audience, were now her most vocal judges. Mrs. Gable, who had laughed at Margot's jokes about Isla's shoes only an hour ago, pulled her silk wrap tighter around her shoulders and took a deliberate step back. "I always thought the inheritance seemed sudden," she whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, the sound of 100 social doors slamming shut at once. Margot's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with her necklace. "Caleb, do something, tell them. Tell them she's lying. She's just a clerk, she's a nobody." Caleb finally looked up, and the pity in his eyes was the sharpest blow of all. "She's the woman who saved my grandmother from the nursing home you tried to dump her in, Margot. She's the one who actually cares about the Sterling name. You just like the stationery." At the mention of her grandmother, a door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Beatrice Sterling stood there, her mind as sharp as the diamonds she wore, leaning on a cane but standing taller than anyone in the room. She didn't say a word. She simply looked down at Margot, a single, slow shake of her head signaling the end of 40 years of family ties. The lead officer stepped forward, the metallic jingle of handcuffs a sudden, jarring punctuation to the silence. "Margot Sterling, you're under arrest for felony fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft." The sound of the first cuff clicking shut seemed to echo off the high ceilings. Margot flinched as if she'd been struck, her knees finally giving way. She sank into the velvet chair she had used as a throne, her designer dress bunching up around her as the officers hoisted her back to her feet. Isla watched from the doorway, the cool night air beginning to swirl around her. The smell of the rain outside was fresh, cutting through the stifling, cloying scent of Margot's expensive floral perfume that had dominated the house for too long. She felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Arthur smiling, not with the pride of a victor, but with the quiet satisfaction of a father who knew his daughter had always been a lion. "Wait!" Margot shrieked as they began to lead her toward the door. She twisted in the officer's grip, her eyes locking onto Isla's calm, steady gaze. "You think you won? You're still nothing. You'll always be a clerk." Isla didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She waited until the room was so quiet that the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "You're right, Margot," Isla said, her voice like a cool blade. "I am a clerk. And I've spent the last 10 years filing away the mistakes of people who thought they were too big to fall. Your file is finally closed." Isla turned her back on the screaming woman and the flashing blue lights, walking down the stone steps toward the waiting car. She didn't look back at the Sterling estate. She didn't need to see the wreckage to know that the storm she had brought had finally cleared the air. The weight of the last few months was gone, replaced by the simple, rhythmic click of her modest heels against the wet pavement, the sound of a woman walking toward a future that was entirely her own. 6 months had passed since the flashing blue lights had faded from the long, winding driveway of the Sterling estate. The autumn air was crisp now, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke instead of the cloying, expensive lilies that Margot had once insisted upon. Isla Vance stood on the gravel path, her hands tucked into the pockets of a simple wool coat. She watched as a crew of movers carefully loaded a heavy, ornate vanity, the last of Margot's personal effects, into the back of a plain white van. The house felt lighter. It was as if the very walls had been holding their breath for a decade and were finally allowed to exhale. Beatrice Sterling sat on the wide wraparound porch, a thick knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. She wasn't the frail, confused woman the world had been led to believe she was. She held a cup of tea with steady hands, her eyes sharp and clear as she watched the final remnants of her daughter-in-law's reign be hauled away. Caleb walked over from the barn, his boots caked with mud. He looked tired, but the haunted tightness around his eyes had vanished. He stopped beside Isla, looking up at the grand structure that was finally, legally, his grandmother's again. "She called again this morning," Caleb said, his voice low. "From the facility, she's still demanding her jewelry, says the state-appointed lawyer is in league with you." Isla didn't turn. She knew the jewelry Margot was obsessing over had already been liquidated to cover the first round of legal fees and restitution. "She's fighting a ghost, Caleb. She still thinks the world is a stage and she's the only one with a script." "She's alone, Isla," he said, though there was no pity in his tone, only a flat observation of fact. "Chloe hasn't visited her once. She's too busy trying to rebrand herself as a survivor of family trauma on social media to associate with a convicted felon." Isla finally looked at him. The cost of the victory was written in the quiet of the estate. The family was fractured beyond repair, a collection of individuals bound by a shared trauma rather than affection. She had won, but the prize was a graveyard of relationships. 2 hours later, Isla sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit visitors' room of the county correctional annex. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and lukewarm coffee. When Margot Sterling was led into the room, the transformation was jarring. Her signature platinum hair was showing 2 inches of gray at the roots, and her skin looked sallow and papery without the soft focus lighting of her former life. She wore a shapeless tan jumpsuit that seemed to swallow her. Margot sat down, the plastic chair screeching against the linoleum. She didn't pick up the phone behind the glass. She just stared at Isla with a raw, vibrating hatred. "You look thin, Margot," Isla said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "You think you're so clever," Margot hissed, her voice cracking. "Living in my house, sleeping in my rooms, you're a thief, Isla, a common, gutter-bred thief who crawled into a family that was too good for you." "It was never your house," Isla replied calmly. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her bag and pressed it against the glass. It was a final notice of bankruptcy. The Sterling accounts had been frozen for the duration of the civil suit. The boutique is closed. The Mercedes was towed 3 weeks ago. Margot's hands began to shake. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white and bony. I built that life. I maintained the standards. Without me, that family would have been nothing but a bunch of grease-stained laborers. Without you, they would have been happy, Isla said. She watched as Margot's face began to contort, the mask of arrogance finally crumbling into something pathetic. Beatrice is doing well. She started a scholarship fund in your father's name. She's using the money you tried to steal to help people who actually work for a living. Margot lunged toward the glass, a strangled sound escaping her throat before a guard stepped forward, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. She collapsed back into the chair, her chest heaving. For the first time, Isla saw the true terror in the woman's eyes, the realization that the world was moving on and she was becoming a footnote in her own story. Isla stood up, smoothing her coat. She didn't feel the surge of joy she had expected. She felt a profound, heavy sense of finality. I'm leaving now, Margot. I won't be coming back. You'll pay for this, Margot screamed as the guard began to lead her away. I'm a Sterling. You can't do this to me. I'm a Sterling. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of her voice. Outside, Arthur Vance was waiting in the car. He looked at his daughter as she climbed into the passenger seat, his expression a mix of pride and a lingering, quiet sadness. He knew what this had taken from her, the years of playing the mouse, the hardening of her heart. Is it done? Arthur asked. Isla looked out the window as they drove past the gates of the annex. She thought of the quiet library back at the estate, the smell of beeswax, and the empty chair where a monster used to sit. She thought of the girl she had been 10 years ago, before the insults and the wine stains had turned her into a hunter. Yes, Dad, Isla said, leaning her head against the cool glass. The file is finally closed. As the car accelerated onto the highway, Isla watched the silhouette of the prison disappear in the rearview mirror. She had her justice, and she had her name. But as she looked at her own reflection in the glass, she realized she was no longer the girl who had started this war. She was someone new, someone forged in the cold fire of revenge, standing alone in the quiet of her own making.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.